Hey y'all, Big Tim here again. Welcome to another episode of Old School and Bass. Today, as promised, we're going to talk about my favorite line, fluorocarbon. I use fluorocarbon the most of any other line out there because, well, let's face it, I'm what they call a dragger. I'm generally dragging a jig or a worm. I'm dragging something along the bottom most of the time. Don't get me wrong, I'll do some other things too, but there's nothing like setting the hook on something that you felt bite and rear him back and pulling him out of heavy cover. That's my favorite thing. So I mentioned the other day that I use Old School Carbon Pro. You can't find this stuff. It's been discontinued now for about 7, 8 years, I guess. But I found a stash of it online that I bought about 6 years ago. And I thought I had a pretty good stash left. Comes to find out, I only have 4 left. So by the end of the year, I'll be switching over to Red Label. Red Label and Carbon Pro are very similar lines in the fact that they're a little bit stiffer, but they don't have as much stretch, which is important for your bottom bouncing lures. You know, your jigs, worms, brush hogs, creatures, anything along those lines. The stretch is important for 2 reasons, or the lack of stretch. When you set the hook, you don't have to walk backwards so far to make a connection to that fish. Secondly, with less stretch, you feel bites better. The more stretch you have in the line, the harder it is to feel a bite. So, another line that I use a lot is InvisX. I use InvisX for any kind of moving lures, crankbaits, spinnerbaits, jerkbaits. InvisX has a little bit more stretch to it, and it's also a little bit more forgiving. When you put this on a bait caster, it generally doesn't have as much coil as these will. They don't have the memory. And since we're talking a lot of times about moving baits have treble hooks, I like having stretch in my line with treble hooks. It helps keep the fish pinned up better. So jerk baits, crankbaits, spinner baits, anything like that, go with InvisX. I've got a good friend that uses Sunline exclusively. I generally don't use Sunline. Haven't tried it. I shouldn't say generally. I haven't tried it. But basically because of cost. This stuff here costs about $23, $24 a spool for 200 yards. This stuff, the Red Label, costs about $15 a spool for 200 yards, which we'll talk about how to spool it up later on. But one thing I do when I'm talking about fluorocarbon, I am generally talking about bait casters. Like I said the other day, I generally don't use a lot of spinning equipment, but I don't recommend using fluorocarbon on spinning equipment. Some guys out there still love it. And if you're one of those guys that want to use fluorocarbon on spinning, make sure that you're using something that's a little more supple. Yeah, that's it, supple. So like InvisX or Sunline, because you want, and make sure you're using a smaller diameter. That's one of the keys. Because with the memory that goes on spinning equipment, you have to have a softer line. Now, the reason I don't use it on spinning equipment is because of the problems it has, you know, with twist and everything else. If you nick fluorocarbon line, just barely nick it, it'll break. If you put it on a bait caster and you cast and you hear it go zzz, it's going to break in that spot. It's one of the big disadvantages of it. If you nick it, kink it, anything like that, it'll break in that spot. Which is why you have to be careful with the knots that you tie. You have to make sure you wet your knots really good. Doesn't matter what knot you use, because I use one that most people would say doesn't work. I use the old-fashioned Palomar knot, and I don't have any problem with it. When I cinch it down, I generally cinch it in my mouth and, you know, have plenty of saliva or spit, whatever, and it's lubricated, so I don't really have to worry about that not breaking. I don't have a problem with the Palomar. I use that Palomar exclusively on my jigs, worms, and such. Now, spinner baits, crankbaits, stuff like that, I generally use an improved clinch knot. Just a little bit easier. Now, the improved clinch, you have to really make sure it's good and wet, because as you're sliding it down, it'll definitely burn that line. You burn fluorocarbon, it'll break. I've used all kinds of different fluorocarbons over the years. This is just kind of what I've stuck with. And some of them have less tensile strength than others. You'll set the hook and break them. That's why I've stayed with Seagar. I have not had a problem when I set the hook with these lines. But you have to tie the correct knots. That's one of the keys. One of my friends, when he switched over to another brand of line that I won't mention, the knots that he always used, he was losing a lot of fish, breaking them off. He learned a new knot, and once he started using that new knot, his problem disappeared. So sometimes if you're having issues with fluorocarbon and breaking off, sometimes you've got bad line, obviously. Sometimes it's the brand of line that you're using, because I can think of a couple, but I won't talk about that. I'm not here to badmouth anybody or anything along that area. But you have to be careful how you tie your knot, what knot you use, and how well you manage it. Fluorocarbon line you have to retie on a much regular basis. We talked about how this line is a little bit stiffer. It'll have a little bit more memory, but it lasts for a long time. You know, I guarantee you I've got fluorocarbon on some of my reels outside that have been on there since last spring, because it's tougher line. What I'll do is I'll manage the memory. I'll tie it off to the trolling motor and take it out and stretch it like we talked about with mono. I go out and tie it, go out about 30, 35 yards, set the hook, wind it up on the reel, set the hook, wind it up on the reel, and stretch it. That'll be good for a whole trip. The next time I go out, I'll probably have to do it again. But I don't like spending a lot of money on line unless I've got a big tournament coming up. And if I do, by all means, I'm definitely going to be changing my line on a regular basis. Fluorocarbon line also is a great line to use if you're using any kind of braided line with a leader, because it's virtually invisible. That's the biggest advantage, is the lack of stretch and the invisibility in water. Now, that being said, even though it's invisible, I had a tournament one time on, what is that, Lewis Smith Lake in Alabama, northern Alabama. I know it's Smith Lake in Alabama. I think it's Lewis, I don't know. But I had a tournament down there where I could not get bit on anything less than 8-pound line. And like I said, I don't like using spin equipment. So putting 8-pound line on a bait caster and setting the hook and getting bit on a baby brush hog, boy, that's tough, trying to set the hook on 8-pound line. But we made it work. Unfortunately, something happened there where the fish were actually biting right behind the hook. It was a weird deal, but practice, they were eating it. Anyway, that's it about fluorocarbon. Tune in. The next time we're together, we'll be talking about braid, and then we're going to get into rod and reel setups. So tune in, and thanks for watching this episode, and be sure to tell your friends about it, like and subscribe. The idea of this is basically to help younger guys get out there and start fishing, whether it's high school teams, college teams. And for you guys that you know me and been fishing with me and around me, we're going to let some tips out there. Just keep staying tuned, and you will find something that will definitely help your fishing no matter what level you're at. Thanks. See you later.